Megazone 23, Part 3. This might be one of the greater film trilogies of all time. It's just such a consistently enjoyable, gratifying set of feature films. And I think I have to be honest here, it's not that. I mean, I think the scripts are good. I think it is a relatively impressive set of effectively literary cyberpunk dystopian exercises. Although, yeah, of course, fundamentally, it's the really slick, idealized animation. Its direction, the color scheme, the audio component. All of these contribute to my ultimate love of the Megazone 23 trilogy more than anything else, because I don't want to sit here and, because I sometimes think it's a bit disingenuous when people claim that fundamentally it's the substance of the narratives which they like in their sort of visual media. Well, hang on a minute. If this had like an eighth of the animation budget, you wouldn't. I'm not going to pretend I would like it as much. I don't think anyone else can either, really. And then besides, like if that's what you really cared about, you'd just be reading literature or well, manga itself, perhaps. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the continuum of science fiction cinema, television series, has a level of ideas which is even a 1/100th of what literature can accomplish. Now, I prefer films. I think I like tricks and illusions, and fundamentally, I was always sort of more compelled by the visual arts than text print anyway. And so naturally, I sort of gravitated toward cinema as a medium before I did prose. But am I going to sit here and pretend that, uh, even the 10 greatest science fiction films of all time have ideas which can amount even a quarter of the ideas in, say, an author like J.G. Ballard's, let alone the 10 greatest authors of science fiction? I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that. Like, even a film like take Existence by Cronenberg, because I have a video on Existence, and it's like this would not be considered a really amazing novel. Now, Videodrome could be, and the proof is in the novel. There is a novelization of Videodrome from a fairly respected author. I don't remember their name right now, unfortunately, and it's quite obvious that, if the film Videodrome never existed, then there was just this novel. I've read some of the novel, and I think that this would be considered a very impressive, worthwhile item. So now, I guess the fundamental point I'm making is, for such a sort of dystopian, gritty genre, yeah, the appeal is the sights and sounds, the bells and whistles of this particular film. It's the awe-inspiring feelings you get from Blade Runner, as opposed to the sort of how miserable and dirty it must be. And it is. No one can deny that. You can say the same thing about Liquid Sky. It's how sort of pretty it is at the end of the day, or how slick and badass Kamikaze 1989, also recently discussed in this channel, appears at the end of the day. I think The Matrix is very shameless about these ideas, and I remember my commenter, very, very smart guy, makes comments smarter than a lot of these videos, frankly, is Barry Moore commented that a sort of a fundamental tonal contradiction in the film The Matrix was that it seemed obvious. Now, these sort of dystopian films tend to have sort of action, sort of kung fu, sort of super slick protagonists, super capable protagonists anyway. In The Matrix, when they were in The Matrix, they were superhumans, so it seemed to this idea that these people could sort of play pretend and give in to these grandiose sort of power fantasy desires seemed to, within the simulation, seemed to suggest that there was the tension there with this idea that, everything's meant to be depressing and horrible, us as viewers witnessing the wider world of the Matrix, the real world, say, because then the tension arises, why wouldn't they want to be sort of why would they ever want to leave the Matrix, uber action badasses forever? And of course, their reason is the agents still get in trouble, but theoretically, isn't that what they would want is to stay in the Matrix forever, cognizant of it, and sort of play God. But anyway, I guess the point I'm making is I don't know how many people read post-apocalyptic or science fiction and think that'd be super cool, but you can watch Mad Max and think, oh, that's super cool. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying fundamentally there is sort of an excitement you get from these sort of media, which is, even though it is meant to be set in grimy times, there's a sort of like, yeah, wouldn't that be cool aspect about it. You sort of fantasize yourself or wish you were playing a video game of some sort where you're doing all these super cool things in such a, what's you as an appealing environment. Maybe it is the danger of it. Maybe it's something in the same reason why people who never lived it and probably really wouldn't want to live it romanticize like 70s New York. Like, oh, wouldn't that be a fucking exciting sort of dangerous unknown time, even though people who lived through it talk about it like it was a nightmare and a war zone. Now, and I think that's also fascinating about how the dystopian cyberpunk genre has been handled in this sort of media, because how's Blade Runner advertised, and then the sequel, the 2049 as well. This cool slick PI with a pistol. You know, Los Angeles seemed pretty seedy in the Maltese Falcon, but you sort of did like the idea of being Sam Spade, of course. And I think that's what's interesting about the sort of visual dimension of cyberpunk and dystopian media. Fundamentally, how far removed are they from the John Carter sort of, that sort of. I know you can claim it's not heroic fantasy because the heroes are more sort of the anti-heroes. They're a bit more ambiguous, but there is still the desire to place yourself in their shoes. There's a lot of people who think the idea of being sort of walking around Rick Deckard in a trench coat is similarly cool in a roundabout way. Maybe a bit more sophisticated and nuanced, but still sort of cool. And maybe that's why it's cool or cooler than, say, pretending to be Han Solo going about the Millennium Falcon with Chewie and then the gang. Whatever the case, I don't think that this is a negative thing. Actually, I sort of shamelessly admit to preferring films for the sort of sensorial component as opposed to the sort of more abstracted sort of, say, professed objective, if you will, sort of pure ideas and substance of literature, which you can sort of really second guess and get at the nitty gritty of. Whereas, a film can be sort of escapism and sort of style and creativity and techno aesthetics for its own sake. I think. I don't think that's a worthless endeavor. A lot of people say, no, you've got to have some story underneath it. Why can't it just be a series of images and contextless battles if I enjoyed it? I'm going to end this sort of probably hacky improvisation here and bring it back to, there's a quote from the great Brendan McCarthy. I brought up Mad Max earlier. He's the art designer on Fury Road, but he was initially well known as sort of one of these old comics figures in the UK in the 80s. He's responsible, along with the great writer Peter Milligan, for an interesting series called There's Paradox, which sort of predated Grant Morrison's Zenith to the point where it's like bad blood between the two, so I've read. To some extent, I don't want to overstate that if it's not necessarily considered the case, to be honest, but the Brendan McCarthy and Milligan worked on a series called, was an anthology, there's an anthology called Strange Days, where the piece itself, Freakwave, I believe originated in another mag, Wario or one of those ones, and Freakwave was initially sort of, bring it back to Mad Max once more, sort of from their perspective, Mad Max meets sort of surfing, post-apocalyptic world warriors, but it's with boats and such rather than with the sort of ground vehicles, automobiles. And naturally they're a bit grumpy about Waterworld later existing, but that's slightly besides the point. Brendan McCarthy, they got slightly bored of the idea of Freakwave and turned it into this hyper psychedelic, almost aggressively so, sort of treatise on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and they were sort of writing partly stream of consciousness, but also sort of complement the images, and they're sort of doing everything for its own sake, and they're sort of trying to do something exciting and, in McCarthy's words, good, rather than trying to make sense of it. Because McCarthy, he writes in sort of a retrospective I read on his website, I believe, at the end of the day, it didn't really matter whether it made sense, whether it was sort of consistent and coherent, or whether it had any sort of real deeper meaning beyond the sort of superficial wash of sort of big ideas and sort of, the temporary excitement of an acid trip, say. If it was good, it was good, And that's sort of where I stand on this sort of media. Like, you could poke at, is there sort of, does Megazone 23 compare to William Gibson? Does it compare to Bruce Sterling? Does it compare to Isaac Asimov, or whatever sort of literature sort of, people who would turn their nose up at sci-fi cinema would cite? Usually it's only like 5 authors they cite, but whatever, that's beside this point. I'm being unfair. They also cite John Brunner and Jack Vance, and if they're particularly clever, they cite the genius that is R.A. Lafferty, or maybe they cite, I don't know how many people cite Heinlein anymore, but Frank Herbert sort of belongs to partly to cinema now because of the film adaptations, not just the David Lynch one from the 80s. Other sci-fi authors, like Philip K. Dick, who's his hand in cinema, obviously, with Blade Runner and some other work, and guys like Alfred Bester, whoever you want to name. I'm done with this improvisation. Thank you, everyone.